welcome. Thanks, Fred, for joining us today.
Yeah, it's great to be here.
Really appreciate you taking the time, and a lot of the conversations that we have more informally. Learned a lot from you over the years. So really looking forward to diving into this topic because I think it is one of the most fascinating combinations of all of these various specialties in terms of understanding, public portfolio construction, public market portfolio construction, plus all of this early stage technology investing that's more typically suited to venture investors. I'm really looking forward to hearing about how you think about this at USV. You've been one of the earliest investors in crypto for a while. What did you see early on that caught your eye?
Well, sitting here listening to you and Kyle sort of lay out the topics that you're going to talk about today, sort of made me think back to 2011 when we first started investing in the sector. And the truth of the matter is, we literally saw none of that. All of that has emerged over the past 7 years and made this sector, 10x or 100x more interesting. But all we really saw was the central technology behind Satoshi's white paper and the idea that you could create a decentralized network without having any trusted party in the middle of it. And that just seemed like one of those once-in-a-decade computer science breakthroughs that was going to unleash a lot of value. And I think that was it. Really, that was the thing. We're like, well, okay, this is big. Mm-hmm. We got to get in on it. And we started investing, and that's honestly all it was in the beginning. And the thing about investing in a sector, as you all well know, is the more that you invest, the more you learn. Mm-hmm. The more you learn, the more you invest, and it's like this really incredible feedback loop. And you get some things wrong, and you say, oh, that theory that we had was wrong. I mean, for example, I'm going to give you a really good example of this. I've told this story a few times. In fact, I told it last night at cocktails to somebody. There's a guy you all probably know who's a peer of yours in the crypto investing sector named Joel Monegro. He's at Placeholder, and he joined USV maybe 5 or 6 years ago as an analyst. And one of the first things he said to us when he joined is, maybe it was 3 years ago he said this. I don't exactly remember when he said it to us. He's like, we should buy Ethereum. Yeah. And I was like, we can't do that. And he said, why? And I said, well, because our limited partners can go buy Ethereum. They can go out and they can buy it. That's not what we get paid to do. We get paid to get our limited partners access into things that they can't get into. And that's always been sort of a central thing about venture. And he's like, yeah, but they're not going to do it. Yeah. And I was like, oh, yeah, well, the smart ones will. And, of course, they didn't. We didn't. And, of course, we should have, right? So, we've learned a lot of things about investing in the sector the hard way. We've made a lot of good investments. So net, I think we're way up on crypto. But we have a lot of regrets about things that we should have done, that we could have done, that we didn't do, that colleagues of ours did do. So it's been challenging to bring a early stage venture capital perspective to this sector. This is a early stage technology, super early stage. So from that perspective, I think it lends itself very much to the things that we know how to do. But there's a whole bunch of other things about it that don't fit very neatly into what we do, and that's what's challenging.
Absolutely. I just want to hit on a point that you said earlier, which is the simplicity of the decision, actually. Right? There's all these complex factors to consider, but at the end of the day, the decision is made on this very simple heuristic of this is a fundamental computer science breakthrough that enables this new design space of things that are now possible that weren't possible before. And we see a lot of really smart people trying to build stuff. Right? And like that's as good of a simple heuristic as any.
Yeah, well, that's worked really well for us, over the years. Not, but the sort of keep it simple, stupid. You can, in the investment business, overthink things. And I really strive to avoid doing that because the big picture, it's very clear to me. Right? Now, how we get from here to there, that's pretty fuzzy. But I've never been more bullish about the long-term crypto opportunity than I am right now. I might have never been more bearish about the short-term opportunity. It's not because of the prices of assets in the market, because those things take care of themselves over time. It's just that I feel like we're really struggling to get out of the gate in a lot of ways. And so that kind of bums me out in the short term, but the long-term potential of this technology, I've never felt more confident in.
So how do you reconcile those two things, right? Like, especially from a portfolio construction perspective, right? Like being long-term bullish, seeing the potential of the technology, but we don't necessarily know which platforms will win.
Right.
We don't necessarily know what the path will be, right? The best technology doesn't always win.
So that's what led us to you. That's what led us to a bunch of other token funds as well. People, at USV, we have never invested in other venture capital funds. We don't do it. We won't do it. I do it personally. My partners do it. But as a firm, we don't do it. We don't think our limited partners need us or want us to do that. So why have we invested in, I think, 6 token funds? The reason is that we feel that right now we got to get a lot of exposure to this sector. We got to be exposed to a lot of crypto networks, to a lot of projects, and our style of investing, culturally as a firm, is actually not to take a lot of bets. We've been in business since 2003, and we've backed about 80 companies over the life, and that includes the token fund investments we've made. So, that's, you think about that, that's not that many companies, certainly over a 15-year period. But in this sector, we'd like to have exposure to 100 crypto networks right now. How are we going to do that? We can't do that. I mean, we would have to change our culture dramatically to do that, and I know we don't want to do that. So we have gone out and found what we think are the brightest people in the sector, and we've put some of our partners' capital with them. And if you look at the aggregated portfolio of all of the token funds that we're in, plus all the investments that we've made directly, we've constructed a pretty great portfolio. But we didn't actually have to do that much of the portfolio construction. We had to figure out that you and Kyle were people we wanted to work with, and we had to do that a bunch of times. But beyond that, you got, I don't even know if it's public, but you just made an investment in a zero-knowledge proofs company. I won't say what it is because maybe it's not announced. That's an important sector. We don't have a direct investment in that sector. You have a direct investment sector, so now we have a direct investment in the sector. So that has been pretty, what's the right word? It's been kind of liberating for us. We don't lose as much sleep at night about missing out on things because it turns out that every interesting project, we're not in Definity, for example. Are you in Definity?
Yes.
We're in Definity. So I feel better. If Definity wins, we win.
So that makes a lot of sense from your perspective, especially with multiple fund investments and working with a bunch of talented managers. I want to go deeper into how you think a manager who's investing directly in the space
How
should,
you.
yeah, how, like, from your perspective, if you were in my shoes,
Right.
like, how would you think about the portfolio construction that best serves your limited partners, right? And so, like, some thoughts that I have around this are actually very aligned with what you said earlier about short-term uncertainty, but long-term clarity, right? Like, we see the long-term vision, self-sovereign data, Web3, non-political money. These are all things that we see really tight product market fit. We know that there will be demand for this as entrepreneurs go and create compelling new experiences. Sometimes I feel like I'm going out. I saw this quote recently about Western Union back in the day with their telegraphs. And someone, I think it was Alexander Graham Bell, goes to them and tries to sell them on telephones. They're like, why would anyone want to talk when they can just send a text message effectively, right? And so sometimes I feel like that person going out and saying why would anyone want to transfer self-sovereign value over the internet and not be stopped or subjected to any sort of restrictions, right? So we have this long-term clarity of what the use cases will be and how the stuff will be used. But then there's this uncertainty of which projects are going to be the ones that really are the underlying layer. Like, is it going to be VCR or Betamax, or is it going to be Blu-ray or HD DVD? We can look at a bunch of the historical examples of tech competition for education. We can look at other networks that have evolved and see what attributes were really necessary for those networks to be dominant.
Right.
What other variables would you consider?
So the way that we do it is that we start at a very high level and we try to identify thematically the areas that we think are going to be most important, at least for whatever phase of the market we're in. And if just looking at your agenda today, we see that you all are really interested in the Web3 stack. We see that you all are really interested in zero-knowledge proofs. We see that you all are really interested in stable coins. So those are 3 areas, right? So maybe 3 of 5 or 3 of 7 or 3 of 10 or whatever you have, those thematic areas. And then you try to identify the very best projects in each of those sectors, and you try to get invested in them. Now, the thing that's interesting about portfolio construction in a crypto fund versus a venture fund is that we struggle with, in the venture business, a couple of things that are challenging that I don't think you have to worry about. One is, once we make an investment, we're stuck in that investment. And the second thing is that we often are conflicted out of investments, right? So if you're in Uber, there's no way Lyft is going to take money from you, right? And that's because in the venture business, we typically are on boards of these companies, and we're actually deeply engaged in the strategic decisions that these companies are making. And I'm on the board of Coinbase, so the folks at Circle probably don't want to take money from me. And so that makes it hard for us to make multiple bets across a certain sector. But I don't think you have that problem. And so I think if you think that there's 4 or 5 smart contract platforms that have the best chance of emerging, you get invested in all of them, right?
Yep.
And then the other thing that you can do, which is harder for us to do, is if you make a mistake, you can unwind it. You say, you know what, we were wrong about that one. Let's sell the position, take a loss, and redeploy that capital in something that is getting traction. We really struggle with that. When we miss something, it's hard for us to get back into it. Maybe in the Series C round they'll let us in, or maybe they won't, or maybe it'll get to a point where priced up to the point where we can't make an investment decision that works for us. So there's a lot of things about the way we have to operate in the venture business that you don't have to worry about, which I think is great for you. But the basic fundamentals, I think, are the same, which is identify the most important themes, and then identify the most important projects, and get exposure to those projects. And then as you see, it's like playing a game of poker. As you get more cards and you start to see, what's developing, you might double down on some things that are really working. You might, get out of some things that aren't working. And I think that's just what you got to do right now. And I think that is what you're doing.
Yeah. It really is. I want to talk a little bit more about the smart contract platforms.
Right.
As we've been pretty public, we think that the big winner in this space is going to be a smart contract platform. We don't necessarily know which one. There's just not enough information. Obviously, you have Ethereum in the lead. You have EOS that launched recently and has some decent traction. You have a few other smaller platforms that launched. But we like to look at the world probabilistically.
Right.
Right. And the way that we think about it is, this space is all open source. So we can't really construct a portfolio around some of these differentiated features.
Because they'll all get adopted into each other.
Exactly, right? And an example of that would be, EOS has human readable account names. Ethereum doesn't. I have sent thousands of Ethereum transactions in my life, and every time I send a transaction, I'm worried, I'm scared. I go double check that address
Right.
3 or 4 times, right? You don't ever want to be that guy who has to be like, oh yeah, I messed that simple thing up, right? But that's not an investable thesis, because that's going to get copied over. The way that we like to think about the portfolio construction there is on the trade-offs, the fundamental choices that these various protocol teams have made in order to achieve their goals. So, something that can't be copied very easily,
Right.
something that comes with a true unforgeable cost, or would require some sort of amazing computer science breakthrough
Right.
to go and solve. And then, once again, we don't necessarily know for sure which one of those trade-offs or attributes is going to be the most important. So the way we think about it is, we want to invest in projects that are the best at something.
Right.
We don't know necessarily which attribute is going to be the most important attribute, but we know that if we're invested in projects that are the best at something, that if that thing ends up being the attribute that matters, that we'll get some exposure there, right? And then as we get new information, I like the poker analogy a lot. As we get new information, as you see the next card, we can then go and rebalance and really leverage liquidity there.
I think that the conventional wisdom in the smart contract space is that one of these is ultimately going to emerge as the winner, and it's going to be like a power law distribution. The winner will be 10 times more valuable than number 2, and number 2 will be 10 times more valuable than number 3, and number 5 is hardly going to even matter. And that may well be true. That's actually the way we're thinking too right now. But it's also possible that if you look at some of these trade-offs that these smart contract platforms are making, that you could have multiple winners based on the thing that they've optimized for. So, if you're willing to accept a lack of true decentralization, but what you really need is massive scalability, then maybe a Ripple or a Stellar, if they really were a smart contract platform, could be something, right? If you feel like true decentralization is the most important thing to you, and you're willing to live with little or no scalability, then maybe Ethereum is your thing, right? So it could be that developers, when they're building these decentralized applications, will pick the chain that they build on based on what they think is the thing that they most need, and you could have a market that ends up having multiple winners. So I don't have a crystal ball on that, and I think it's important as an investor to be open to the fact that things may play out differently than what conventional wisdom is right now.
Yeah, absolutely. There's all these weird shocks to the system that come in, right? And so we really try and think ahead about what those might be. Like for smart contract platforms, one would be interoperability and standardization of like the other layers of the Web3 stack.
Yes.
Right. So if everyone's running the same state transition machine or VM layer, and everyone,
which is like WASM, right?
Yes, everyone seems to be standardizing towards WASM or eWASM, and that just means that now your dApp is like much more easily portable across various chains. And if you have interchain communications, so now you can actually transfer value between chains too. Right. And so how does the emergence of interoperability affect the thesis of which smart contract platform actually captures most of the value? Right.
Well, one of the things that we've seen investing in networks, as opposed to crypto networks, is that these network effects sometimes are very subtle. And Nick Grossman, who might be in the audience today, Nick's one of my colleagues at USV.
He's back there.
Likes to talk about the attachment points, right? So when you have a network with a lot of attachment points, that's actually a pretty powerful network effect. Like it's kind of hard to swap out those attachment points, right? Like if all of these other pieces of infrastructure out there in the crypto world are already supporting, and actually ERC20 is a good example of that, right? Why do an ERC20 token versus roll your own? Well, if you do an ERC20 token, exchanges already support ERC20, wallets already support ERC20, like all those things are just going to be there for you. So, well then, I guess I'll just do an ERC20 token, even though you're making a bunch of maybe suboptimal decisions at the same time when you do that. So that's a place that we look at, and so that's why Ethereum, for all of its problems, and there are many, it's hard not to bet on it in some ways because it's already developing a lot of that I think of like tentacles, like out into the world and attachment points, and so that's what the other smart contract platforms are going to have to go up against.
I completely agree. And a great example of that is all these new fiat collateralized stablecoins that are coming out. There's other types of stablecoins. I think specifically the fiat collateralized stablecoins are interesting here because one of the questions that we like to ask ourselves all the time is, what is the fork risk? Like, what happens if this network forks? Well, as soon as you have assets that are exogenous to that network, whether those are fiat dollars or tokenized securities, et cetera, then those assets being on a particular network actually is the biggest barrier to entry, because that's something that can't be copied, it can't be forked. Wherever Gemini and Circle and Paxos and these other stablecoin suppliers, whichever fork of Ethereum they say is the right fork, is the one that has the actual billions of dollars of value or hundreds of millions of dollars of value on it. And so that, I think, is a huge advantage for Ethereum. Because ERC20 is by far the dominant standard, and you have all of these exogenous assets that are basically secured by Ethereum and can't be forked away, can't be copied. Once again, it's a truly unforgeable, defensible feature.
The other thing that I think, this idea of side chains or an intermediate ledger that you write to, most of the time, and then you occasionally write from the intermediate ledger down to the real ledger, sort of like a batch type model as opposed to a real-time transaction processing model, is an idea that's been around for a long time. I remember when Blockstream was first getting started, and this is maybe 5 or 6 years ago, Adam and I forget what the other guy's name, Austin, came in to see us, and they were just like, side chains is the future. This is a long time ago, and we got Lightning, and we got a number of projects on Ethereum. I think that is going to work. I don't really understand why that isn't more established as like a way to build applications. And I think that could resolve a lot of the scaling challenges. Maybe there's security issues or decentralization challenges with side chains that I'm not totally up to speed on. But So I guess the reason I'm bringing that up is that there are other things that, like you said, could come out of, not nowhere, because we all know that exists, but could come out and the adoption of that could change the calculations we're making about, the trilemma or whatever, methodology you're using to evaluate these trade-offs. And all of a sudden, your models are wrong because something new's emerged that flips it all on its head.
Absolutely. This is a really good question. I don't necessarily want to go too deep into the technical trade-offs with layer 2 versus layer 1, but I generally agree with you that it's a plausible solution.
Right.
Do we know for sure? Not necessarily. I think it's not only that we don't know, I think it's actually unknowable.
Right.
To know, how that is going to play out. But as we get new information about layer 2 versus layer 1, for us, it really feeds into this model of how do we allocate the portfolio, right? So, we've made some investments in layer 2 solutions. We really think the only way that Ethereum will work is if layer 2 solutions succeed.
Right.
And we've made some investments where there's base layer scaling.
Right.
Right. Competing smart contract platforms that if layer 1 is really the right answer, then we want to have exposure there, right?
So that's exactly what I was talking about in terms of portfolio construction. You can call it hedging. I'm not sure hedging is exactly the right word to use. It's just you want to have a diverse set of bets. At this stage in the market, you want to have a diverse set of bets that protects you from things going one way versus another, and then you want to be nimble. And as you start to see the market, voting, and I love the fact that you showed data from the Ethereum blockchain. I know you all have invested in a bunch of tools to actually see what the hell is actually going on. That's super important. I mean, it's too easy as an investor to talk to other investors and talk to the entrepreneurs who are starting companies and let that be, your information flow. I think you got to actually get into the technology and see what's actually happening. Those other two sources of data are really valuable, but I think you have to know what's actually going on in these networks. And sometimes it's easy to be lazy and not do that work and just listen to what the buzz is and follow that around, and that can lead you to the wrong place sometimes.
Absolutely. Groupthink is pervasive. I think people don't necessarily appreciate the power of these biases in their decision-making process.
Well, one of the reasons that I really encourage my partners to get to know you and Kyle, and ultimately led to Union Square Ventures becoming a partner at Multicoin, was that I saw the two of you write some things that were contrarian. That, and people were like, you guys are crazy, what are you thinking? I think it's super important to be, contrarian at some level, to not buy into, the conventional thinking. Some of the conventional thinking will be right and some of it will be wrong. So I really appreciate people who have the courage to stake out a contrarian point of view and articulate it, defend it. Doesn't mean that you have to be right, by the way.
Yeah.
But just the willingness to do it, I think, is super important, and will ultimately lead you to some places that other people won't get to.
The feedback has been amazing, right? Like that's actually, I think, an asymmetric advantage for us is knowing how to use the broader ecosystem for research purposes, right? There's this rule, I think it's called Cunningham's Law. It's like the best way to get an answer on the internet isn't to post a question, it's to post the wrong answer.
Right.
And I can tell you from experience, it works.
Well, one of the things that is challenging, though, about operating in a publicly traded asset class versus a privately traded asset class is when you write a lot about privately held securities. You can get a lot of conversation going with entrepreneurs and other investors about these questions. it tends to be a relatively civil conversation. I remember, let's go back to like 2007, we made a bunch of social media investments, and I thought that social media-based advertising was going to be as powerful as search-based advertising, and I started writing about that, and a lot of people were saying, oh, you're crazy, and nothing's ever going to beat search, but these were pretty civil debates, the kind of debates you might have in a room like this. One of the problems in the public markets is there are these people who are super long Bitcoin or super long Ethereum or whatever, and you write something that's negative about that, and then they just come after you with this vengeance, and they're usually individual investors who are investing their own capital, and they're somehow agitated that you're articulating something that's negative to their investment thesis, and I think it takes a lot of guts in the crypto sector to stake out an unpopular position, because it's just the number of people that come after you is crazy.
It's brutal. It's a trade-off, really, right? So the public markets give us like some of these negative effects of just like how people react, but then we get the positive trade-off of being able to take advantage of liquidity, right? So as we get more information, we can change our portfolio composition. We can think about not only entry prices but also exit prices, which is just traditionally difficult for illiquid investments. You exit at whatever the exit is.
And the other thing that's going to happen is that like you will have already written something that turns out to be wrong. For the next 20 years, people are going to be tweeting this at you and emailing it at you, throwing it in your face. And I think you just got to take that as a badge of honor and a willingness to take a public stand on something. So many people are unwilling to do that. So many people they don't have the courage to take a position publicly, and then they're the ones who are throwing it in your face. So
it's honestly, it was very inspired by your writing. So I've been reading your blog for about 10 years and learned quite a lot from your approach there. Public markets are different, obviously, and I think crypto in particular brings out this, because it's such a global movement and because so many people are so heavily invested in it, because they see this as a huge opportunity where retail could get in first. So emotions do run pretty high.
The other problem is there's a suspicion that you're, pumping and dumping or really just, promoting your position. And by the way, I do that, right? We make an investment in Coinbase. I'll talk about Coinbase, on my blog, and I understand that at some level that's evangelizing for that company. But again, in the private markets, it's kind of hard for people to figure out how to get exposure to that asset. In a publicly traded asset, of course, if you're advocating for EOS, anybody can go out and buy EOS. So I think it's more challenging to do. And I think that you just have to be mindful of all those things. But I still think it's worth doing because, like you said, taking a position catalyzes a conversation and might end up convincing you that you were wrong about something and helps you, reshift your investment strategy in midstream. And a lot of times it's those shifts, those midstream shifts, that end up being the most successful investments you make. It's not like that initial thing that you did because you figured out that was wrong. But see, if you didn't make that initial thing, you would have never figured out it was wrong to get to the right thing, right? So again, it's about taking a position. It's about making an investment. It's about putting some skin in the game that ultimately leads you to the right place. If you're not willing to do any of those things, you never get to the right place.
Yeah, it's easy to sit on the sidelines. But being in the arena is the most educational experience. Like that's where you get the information, right? I totally agree there. And to go back to your point about talking about these assets publicly, I really see that as an ability for us as investors to add value, right? Because if we're able to draw attention to a project and that attracts developers or attracts other stakeholders in the ecosystem to really get involved with that project, then we are helping to create alpha in a sense, right? It's the same thing as like when you go invest in an early stage, let's say any other type of technology company, well, knowing that you are backing that team might encourage an executive to join, or might encourage a partner to work with them, right? In the public markets, like we still want to be able to take advantage of that power and of that ability to help our portfolio companies, while having this trade-off of, well, perception might be.
Well, and there's another thing that we haven't talked about, which you just wrote about on your blog maybe yesterday, that I think is the next thing, or one of the next things that we're going to see in this sector, which is when investors start to engage in the network, right? So, we can do this a little bit in the, I invest in Twitter and then I become, a vocal personality on Twitter. Okay, so that, maybe helps Twitter a little bit, but I think what crypto investors have the potential to do with staking and mining and validating transactions and putting storage on the Filecoin network or transcoding on the LivePeer network is becoming active participants in these networks. You've got the tokens, you've got the assets that gives you the ability to go out and participate in those networks. That, I think, is going to be really fundamental to performance in this sector in the long term. And I think that it will allow you to potentially impact the uptake rate of that network. But I also think it's going to generate incremental returns, financial returns, because there's financial rewards in most of these crypto networks for doing those things. And it's really early, I think, in the development of that whole set of activities, but I'm very excited about that, and we're figuring out how to do that at USV. You guys either have already figured out how to do that or are in the process of figuring out how to do that, and most of the token funds that we're invested in are working on that, and I think that's going to be an increasingly important part of being a crypto fund manager.
Yeah, it's all looking for ways to add value back. And there's like the technical side of it with the staking and providing the services to the network. I also think that investors play a really valuable part in governance.
For sure.
Right? And of course, being on the board of companies, et cetera, like VCs are used to helping govern teams and helping them get to the right decisions. But I think in crypto, it's a little bit different, right? Like instead of being team level governance, it's more network level governance because it's about telling the story to the whole community and persuading people to your side with this much larger selectorate, while maintaining cohesion amongst the group. And this is a challenge that we've been thinking about is how do we best add value on the governance side as well as on the actual liquidity within the network side.
Well, one of the areas that we're used to doing this that I think is harder in crypto but necessary is on the people side of the business. So, the investors in Facebook helped convince Mark Zuckerberg to bring Sheryl Sandberg in as his business partner to build that company. At Coinbase recently, the folks at Andreessen Horowitz introduced Brian to Asif Herji, who's now the president of Coinbase, and that has been a fantastic partnership that I think is going to really help Coinbase a lot. And we do that a lot for our companies. Ethereum needs that, right? We know that Vitalik is not a CEO. Vitalik is an evangelist. He's a brilliant computer scientist. But Ethereum should be more like a company, right? You look at what EOS is doing and you look what Ethereum is doing, and it's like, if Ethereum was doing what EOS was doing, they'd be crushing it, but they're not. And they don't have enough money. They don't have enough developers. They don't, their go-to-market strategy is non-existent. They're not behaving like a company. And if all of us who own Ethereum could go to Vitalik and say, look, this thing you got going in Switzerland, it's not working. Fire these fuckers who don't know what the hell they're doing, and put somebody great in there who could help you build this thing into a monster. Like, that's what we would do. I don't know how to do that. Like, there's no mechanism to do that. That's painful. Just sitting there holding the asset, just watching them whittle the value away, and you're like, God damn it. I know what to do here. Just look at it. Every great company has done this. Just do that. And they don't do it.
And it's hard to get them to listen, right? Because first of all, who do you have to convince? Right? In this case, maybe it's Vitalik, but there's a whole decentralized group of developers, et cetera, that need to be convinced. And this is exactly kind of the question that we're trying to think of is,
well, if that whole group thinks that they're killing it, then they got their head up their ass, okay? They're not killing it. They're blowing it.
They have the lead.
And they're blowing it.
Yep.
And it's just it's so obvious what to do, and they're not doing it. That just kills me. And if I was an investor in a company that was doing that, I'd be just the person who was running that company would hate me, because every fucking day they'd hear from me, and eventually, they would, figure it out.
And you can apply real pressure, because you have real power and control.
But it's not actually even that. It's not like, we fire them or anything. It's just that we annoy the shit out of them to the point where they listen to us.
Well, that strategy might still work with Ethereum. I think, the question might be, how can we as investors, and let's pick on Ethereum in particular, because I think you're completely right? How can we as investors put enough pressure on the team using the network, using the rest of the stakeholders, and be a symbol?
I think it would be cool to call a shareholders meeting, call a token holders meeting. Literally, get, people who collectively own 20 or 30% of the tokens to call a token holders meeting, in, I don't know, Geneva or something, and sort of demand, that the community and the leaders of the community, get their, act together.
Yeah, they are accountable to the token holders, and perhaps instead of the Ethereum core developer calls, there can be a call that has some of the larger holders that help organize this kind of thing, because obviously someone has to pay for it, et cetera, right?
It starts with leadership, right? Most great tech companies have a founder, visionary technology person, and Vitalik is as good as it comes at that, right?
Yep.
They also have a business person who's a manager who hits ship dates, and they can't meet a fucking date. They just, it's impossible. So they're either not scoping the project correctly, or they're just not showing up to work, or whatever it is. But that's got to change, And it takes a manager. It takes somebody who knows how to lead people and get shit done. And these systems are not that different from other software-based businesses at the end of the day. There's a lot of things that are different, but at the end of the day, it's about shipping. It's about getting technology to improve and perform and get better and better and better. And the projects that do that are going to win, and the projects that don't do that are going to lose. That's just, that part has not changed.
And I think it's on the investors to help make that happen. I can remember from my last company, right? Once we brought on some VCs and we had some VCs on the board, they helped, first they gave us the tools that we needed and the advice that we needed to actually mature the operations. But then they also gave us the accountability that we needed.
Right.
And the accountability in the early stage projects, I think, is one of the most important things that investors can provide.
Right. So I'm probably coming across as an asshole, and there is a side of me that can be that way, but we don't start that way. We start with hey, you should meet this person. Hey, here's some really great tools that you can use, whether it's software tools to manage projects, or things like OKRs and KPIs and methodologies to run a business, and you really you really think maybe you need a stronger VP engineering, or you should build up your product organization because it's underpowered relative to your engineering team. So like we start with like a lot of like, but at some point the tough love has to come in too, which is like, yo, it's not working. Because people sometimes they can't admit to themselves that they're screwing up. They need, they're in denial, or they don't want to admit it to themselves, whatever. They need somebody to kind of like hold them accountable.
Yep. And maybe this is where like there is a significant trade-off with crypto versus with traditional investments, right? Because like the option to exit might change how the investors behave in terms of providing that accountability.
That kind of sucks. Like in the public markets, a lot of public market investors are like, I'll just sell the stock. But there's some public market investors who behave more like private market investors, who agitate, and I think that's our responsibility as investors. And that's what we should do. And that's what crypto fund managers need to figure out how to do. We have to become the large shareholders who can help represent the interests of the broader token holder base and the small token holders who are just as frustrated but can't do anything about it.
Completely agree. Well, thank you so much for joining us today, and thank you, everyone.